I had always believed that hard work spoke for itself, that dedication and persistence would eventually earn recognition. Every morning, I arrived at the office early, even before the sun had risen, clutching my coffee and a sense of quiet determination. I stayed late, meticulously double-checking reports, volunteering for extra projects no one else wanted, and anticipating problems before they even appeared. I took pride in being dependable, the person everyone could rely on, and I thought that consistency would count for something. But the truth slowly settled in like a cold draft. It didn't. My boss had favorites, and no matter how much effort I poured into my work, it seemed invisible compared to the flamboyant displays of competence from others. I watched as colleagues with louder personalities or more charm received praise, promotions, and opportunities that I had quietly earned. Even when my reports exceeded expectations, my ideas were brushed off in meetings, barely acknowledged, while someone else got the nod for suggesting something similar later. It was frustrating in a way I couldn't fully articulate. I felt overlooked, invisible, and underappreciated, yet I kept my head down, convincing myself that patience and perseverance would eventually pay off. Every slight, every dismissive comment, every ignored proposal added layers of quiet resentment. I began to notice the subtle patterns: who got called into one-on-one meetings, whose achievements were emailed to upper management, and whose mistakes were excused with a smile. My work ethic, once a source of pride, started to feel like a personal burden. Even in casual conversations, I could see it. "You should have said that during the meeting," my boss would remark to someone else, completely ignoring the fact that I had already outlined the same point in detail. Or, "Great job on that project," would be said to someone who had contributed minimally, as if the hours I spent perfecting every detail didn't exist. I couldn't understand why loyalty and dedication weren't enough to matter. Still, I continued showing up, believing that consistency would eventually force recognition. But with every passing day, the gap between my effort and my acknowledgement widened. I began to feel a simmering frustration building underneath the surface, a quiet rage that contrasted sharply with the polished, professional exterior I forced myself to maintain. I had always seen myself as fair and patient, but slowly, it became impossible to ignore the injustice. It was in these early days of unnoticed effort and favoritism that I realized something crucial. If I wanted to be seen, if I wanted my work to matter, I couldn't rely on goodwill or hope alone. And though I couldn't admit it to anyone yet, a plan small and deliberate began to take shape in my mind, one fueled by frustration, clarity, and the promise that patience would no longer be passive. I still remember the exact moment my boss said the words that changed everything. I had walked into his office that morning with the same mix of hope and nervous anticipation I always carried when discussing my career. My presentation was polished, my achievements clearly laid out, and I had rehearsed every point, every figure, every argument that proved I was more than ready. I thought, maybe this time, recognition would finally come. Maybe this time, all the late nights, extra work, and endless effort would be acknowledged. He looked up at me with that same unreadable expression, the one that always made me doubt myself, and shook his head. "You're just not ready for a promotion," he said casually, as if it were the simplest fact in the world. "You need more experience before taking on responsibilities at that level." I blinked, waiting for anything that might soften the blow. There was nothing, just the cold, clinical dismissal. Like my years of hard work had evaporated into thin air. I felt a wave of humiliation crash over me, my chest tightening and stomach dropping. How could he say that? I had sacrificed evenings, weekends, even personal plans to prove my worth. Every extra report, every project I had taken on, every little detail I had perfected had led to this moment, and yet it was ignored. I wanted to argue, to list my contributions, to make him see the countless ways I had earned this opportunity, but the words caught in my throat. My pride had been wounded, and beneath it was a strange, simmering anger I hadn't allowed myself to feel before. As I walked back to my desk, the office suddenly felt smaller, suffocating even. Every glance from colleagues, every polite smile, every casual nod from someone I had thought respected me now felt loaded with judgment. Was I really not ready? Or was this just favoritism disguised as corporate rationale? Doubt gnawed at me, whispering that maybe I had been naive to think fairness had a place here. And yet, somewhere under that doubt, a fire began to flicker, a quiet determination that what had been dismissed once would not be dismissed again. I forced myself to smile politely at the coworkers who passed, hiding the mix of embarrassment and rising resentment. Inside, I replayed the conversation again and again, dissecting every word, every inflection, every hesitation. How had my efforts been so thoroughly overlooked? Why had all my loyalty, my sacrifices, and my perseverance meant so little? It was humiliating, yes, but it was also clarifying. I began to understand that change would not come from begging, from overworking, or from hoping someone would notice. If I wanted recognition, if I wanted justice, I would have to engineer it myself. By the end of the day, the humiliation had transformed into something more potent, simmering resentment mixed with strategy. Why? I didn't speak to anyone about it yet. No one needed to know that a quiet plan was forming in my mind. But as I closed my laptop and walked out of the office that evening, a shift had occurred. I wasn't just frustrated anymore, I was ready. And the next time my worth was questioned, I knew I wouldn't wait for permission. The next morning, I made a decision that felt almost revolutionary. I arrived at the office on time, did my assigned tasks, and nothing more. No volunteering for extra projects. No staying late to perfect someone else's report. No anticipating problems before they happened. For the first time in years, I drew a line and refused to cross it. It wasn't about laziness, it was about control. I realized that my overextension had been invisible to the very person whose approval I had been chasing. So I would no longer give freely without recognition. At first, it felt strange. I caught myself hovering over reports, instinctively wanting to fix minor errors. But I stopped. I reminded myself that boundaries were my new strategy. Colleagues began to notice. Some gave subtle looks of surprise, while others whispered about the sudden change. A few even tried to pull me into tasks I had always handled without complaint, only to be met with polite refusal. It was fascinating and a little empowering to see that my absence in the extras created ripples I hadn't anticipated. My boss, of course, didn't notice immediately, but the cracks began to show. Reports that had always been perfect now required minor corrections elsewhere, and the workflow I had quietly maintained for years was suddenly more chaotic. Meetings ran longer, deadlines crept closer, and I could feel the subtle tension in the air. The balance of power, which had always tilted in his favor, was beginning to shift. I was no longer the unnoticed workhorse, I was a quiet force, and he hadn't realized what he had taken for granted. Even my colleagues started treating me differently. Some approached me with newfound respect, hesitant acknowledgement of my capabilities, while others seemed uneasy, unsure how to navigate this new version of me. Every small interaction reinforced the anticipation. Something was about to change. The office atmosphere, once predictable, now carried an undercurrent of tension, a silent acknowledgement that the rules I had followed for years were no longer in play. By the end of the week, I felt a mix of satisfaction and patience. I wasn't seeking revenge yet. I was simply reclaiming the power I had unknowingly given away. But in the quiet moments, I could almost feel it, the brewing consequence, the shift in the dynamics that had long favored the boss. It was subtle, almost invisible, but undeniably real. And I knew that when the time came, that shift would be the foundation of something far greater. It didn't take long for the effects of my withdrawal to start surfacing. Small, almost imperceptible issues began cropping up: emails sent with incomplete attachments, scheduling overlaps, minor miscommunications that I had always quietly corrected before anyone else noticed. At first, the mistakes were shrugged off as ordinary oversights. But as they accumulated, a pattern began to form. I watched from my desk, quietly observing the subtle panic that started to ripple through the office. My boss, once so confident and untouchable, began showing signs of irritation I hadn't seen before. He would frown over reports that were slightly delayed, mutter under his breath about deadlines slipping, and call unexpected meetings to clarify points I had normally handled without notice. It was as if the infrastructure I had silently maintained for years was suddenly crumbling, and he didn't know why. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had been the invisible engine keeping things running smoothly, and now, by stepping back, I had exposed the fragility of his control. Colleagues started whispering in corners, pointing out small errors, and asking questions that previously wouldn't have crossed their minds. I could see the subtle unease in my team's body language, the slight hesitation in their tone when addressing my boss, and even the occasional sideways glance toward me, a silent acknowledgement of my absence and its impact. Each tiny mistake, each overlooked detail amplified the growing tension, and I couldn't help but feel a quiet satisfaction at seeing the imbalance I had long endured start to tip. The most telling moment came during a client call. A simple miscommunication about a project timeline caused the client to raise a concern that would have been instantly diffused if I had been involved. My boss scrambled to respond, stumbling over explanations, while I leaned back in my chair, carefully maintaining the facade of indifference. The cracks were widening, small but unmistakable, and it became clear that my absence had created a vacuum of competence he had taken for granted. As the week progressed, the office atmosphere subtly shifted. No one spoke openly, but the tension was palpable. My boss's frustration, combined with mounting micro-errors, painted a picture of growing risk. It was the first real sign that my withdrawal was not just noticed, it was destabilizing the very foundation he had always assumed was unshakable. And though I kept my demeanor calm and professional, inside, I felt a quiet thrill, knowing that patience and restraint were slowly turning the tables in my favor. While the office buzzed with minor chaos, I used the newfound space to focus on myself in ways I had never allowed before. Instead of pouring energy into tasks that went unnoticed, I quietly honed my skills, studying industry trends, refining my expertise, and learning strategies that could make my work impossible to ignore. I drafted detailed reports, compiled case studies, and kept meticulous records of every project I led or contributed to, ensuring that when the time came, my accomplishments would speak for themselves. Simultaneously, I began networking strategically. I reached out to influential colleagues and stakeholders, not for immediate gain, but to establish relationships that would subtly shift the balance of attention in my favor. I attended conferences, joined professional groups, and engaged in discussions that highlighted my knowledge without drawing overt attention. Each conversation planted seeds of recognition, creating small ripples that my boss would eventually notice too late. Every day, I watched him move through the office obliviously, assuming that his authority remained untouchable. He continued giving high-profile tasks to others, taking credit for initiatives he barely touched, and dismissing contributions that were now clearly mine. The contrast couldn't have been sharper. I was becoming quietly indispensable while he floated in a bubble of overconfidence. Every oversight, every misjudged assignment, every time he glanced at my calm composure and failed to see the power brewing. Deep in my anticipation, I started dropping subtle hints in meetings, strategically showcasing results in ways that made others notice, but didn't alarm him yet. The whispers began, colleagues quietly pointing out that certain successes were largely due to my input, that projects ran smoother when I was involved, and that some decisions reflected foresight no one else had. The FOMO was tangible. My peers began wondering how he could overlook my value for so long, sensing an untapped potential that might soon tip the scales. By keeping my work visible in the right circles and invisible to the wrong ones, I was engineering a slow-burning reveal. My boss remained unaware, wrapped in his habitual favoritism, while I quietly built credibility, influence, and momentum. It was a delicate dance, and with every measured step, The stage for the coming reversal became more certain, more inevitable. It happened during a routine team meeting, one I almost didn't expect to carry any significance. I had submitted a report weeks earlier, quietly anticipating it would be overlooked like so many times before. Instead, the department had singled it out, praising its clarity, thoroughness, and forward-thinking recommendations. The words caught everyone by surprise, including my boss, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His eyes flicked toward me, a mixture of disbelief and irritation barely masked behind a professional facade. For the first time, my contributions were acknowledged in a public setting. Colleagues exchanged glances, and whispers floated around the room about how well the work had been executed. My boss, who had dismissed the same attention and effort countless times, now looked out of touch, his favoritism exposed without a word being spoken. I could feel this subtle shift in energy. People were beginning to see me as capable, competent, and undeniably valuable. It wasn't a dramatic confrontation or an orchestrated reveal. It was a simple acknowledgement that carried enormous weight. The contrast between my quiet competence and his obliviousness was palpable. I remained composed, accepting the praise modestly. But inside, a sense of quiet triumph swelled. The office was no longer entirely his domain. I had carved out a space where my work could shine, even if unintentionally, and it had started to turn heads. Even my colleagues began treating me differently, offering small nods of respect, consulting me for advice, and subtly acknowledging the gap between what I had been contributing and what had been recognized before. It was a satisfying taste of validation, the first tangible sign that patience and strategy could create meaningful change. I noticed my boss attempting to regain control, interjecting with comments and corrections, but they rang hollow against the evidence of my value. By the time the meeting ended, I felt a quiet surge of empowerment. The recognition had been small, almost accidental, but it marked a turning point. People were beginning to see what I had always known. My work mattered, my dedication was real, and the imbalance of power was slowly beginning to tilt. The anticipation of what could come next hummed in the background, a promise of further shifts that would soon become undeniable. Sitting at my desk after everyone had left, I finally allowed myself to think without filters. The office was quiet, but my mind was anything but. I kept replaying the events of the past weeks, the subtle power shifts, the small recognitions, and the cracks I had exposed in the boss's authority. A question not at me: was it wrong to feel satisfaction at seeing him falter, even in small ways? I had always believed in fairness and integrity, yet here I was, quietly orchestrating a subtle reversal that, if revealed, might seem calculated or even vindictive. I thought about all the evenings I had sacrificed, the weekends I had given, the personal moments I had missed to prove my worth. I had done it for the work itself at first, believing that dedication alone would earn recognition. But now, it felt like survival, like reclaiming a part of myself that had been consistently undervalued. The patience I had cultivated over years of overlooked effort had become a weapon, a quiet assertion of self-worth that I had denied myself for too long. I wondered if anyone else would understand the constant tension of giving everything and being dismissed, of watching others receive credit for what I had quietly built. I realized that this wasn't about revenge in a petty sense. It was about validation, about ensuring that my efforts, my time, and my dedication had tangible meaning. It was about taking back control in a situation that had always felt unfair. A wave of empathy washed over me as I reflected on how often we measure ourselves by the approval of others. How many times had I doubted my own abilities simply because someone else failed to notice? I knew I wasn't alone in feeling unseen, undervalued, or dismissed, and I realized that my actions, while strategic, were rooted in the universal desire to be recognized for what we give, to have our worth acknowledged without having to beg for it. As the office lights dimmed and silence settled in around me, I felt a sense of clarity. I wasn't acting out of malice, I was asserting myself, standing firm in the value I had always carried. but had never fully claimed. That quiet reflection strengthened my resolve. When the moment came to shift the balance more visibly, I would do it with confidence, integrity, and purpose. And for the first time in a long while, I felt a deep, unshakable belief in my own worth. The moment came during a quarterly review presentation, one of those meetings designed to impress upper management, but often drowned in charts and jargon. I had prepared meticulously, as I always did. But this time it wasn't just about showing competence, it was about demonstrating that my contributions were indispensable. As I spoke, I highlighted insights, trends, and recommendations that no one else had anticipated. Every statistic, every analysis, and every strategic suggestion was crafted to show not just effort, but foresight. I noticed my colleagues shifting in their seats, eyes widening slightly at points I emphasized. Some exchanged subtle nods or whispered comments, recognizing the depth of work I had consistently put in. Largely unnoticed, I could see the first cracks in the facade my boss maintained. He tried to interject, to guide the discussion, but his comments now seemed reactive, almost defensive, rather than authoritative. The contrast was striking. The meticulous, prepared, quietly brilliant work in front of the room versus his faltering attempts to maintain control. By the time I finished presenting, the room was filled with a palpable energy. My insights had addressed problems no one had solved before, and solutions that had once been my silent contributions were now undeniably visible. Colleagues began to question decisions that had previously gone unchallenged. Why wasn't this report prepared this way before? One asked softly, and the murmur of agreement rippled through the room. My boss's expression shifted from prideful control to barely hidden irritation, his habitual confidence cracking under the weight of attention I had quietly commanded. The most satisfying moment was subtle, almost invisible. A senior executive made a point to ask me for clarification on certain projections, highlighting my input without needing to call out my name explicitly. The room recognized the value I had contributed for years, and my boss, seated beside me, could only nod along, powerless to redirect the acknowledgement. Tension escalated palpably, like a storm cloud slowly spreading across the office. I felt a quiet thrill, knowing the perception of my indispensability had finally taken hold. Even after the meeting ended, the ripple effect continued. Colleagues approached me privately, expressing admiration or subtle envy, hinting that they were starting to notice what had always been obvious to me. And my boss, he retreated to his office, closing the door with a slightly forced calm, aware, somewhere deep inside, that the dynamic had begun to shift in ways he hadn't anticipated. The anticipation of what would come next hummed in the air, quiet, but charged with inevitability. The day of the annual client presentation arrived, and the tension in the office was almost tangible. I had been preparing for weeks, analyzing every detail, anticipating every question, and mapping out solutions to problems that had plagued projects for months. The client was high profile, influential, and notoriously demanding, the type whose approval could shape the reputation of the entire department. I knew this was the moment when years of unseen effort, patience, and strategy could finally pay off, and I was ready. From the moment the meeting began, it became clear who held the room. My boss opened with the usual rehearsed introduction, confident and polished, projecting the authority he had long assumed was untouchable. But as the discussion turned to complex project issues, it was my analyses, recommendations, and real-time problem-solving that commanded attention. Every solution I proposed was grounded in insight and practicality, anticipating questions before they were asked. The client leaned in, impressed, nodding at points I had emphasized, clearly valuing my expertise above all else. My boss began to flounder. He stumbled over details, contradicted himself, and tried to reclaim authority with half-formed statements that only highlighted his lack of preparation. Subtle as it was, the contrast was unmistakable. Where I was calm, precise, and confident, he appeared flustered, reactive, and visibly uncomfortable. Colleagues started exchanging glances, their eyes betraying a recognition of what was unfolding. The power dynamic, so long in his favor, had reversed completely, and it was happening in front of witnesses who would remember it. As the meeting progressed, the client turned directly to me, asking for clarification on a key decision my boss had mishandled. I calmly explained the rationale, offering solutions that preemptively solved the very problems that had left the boss stammering. There was a brief, almost cinematic pause, and I felt the weight of the moment, the silent acknowledgement that years of invisible work had prepared me to rise precisely when the spotlight shone bright. Saint, the room seemed to shift. The respect I had earned through diligence, patience, and quiet strategy was undeniable. The final blow came when the boss attempted to answer a follow-up question, but misquoted figures and contradicted his own previous statements. The client paused, eyebrows raised, and the awkward silence was unmistakable. I stepped in smoothly, delivering the information with clarity and authority. Colleagues, clients, and even the few executives observing recognized the moment the boss had been exposed, his competence questioned publicly, and I had risen to the occasion without arrogance, only execution. By the end of the meeting, the applause, both literal and figurative, was directed toward me. My colleagues subtly acknowledged the shift, some with quiet admiration, others with envy, but all aware of the reversal. My boss, red-faced and muttering defensively under his breath, could do nothing to reclaim the authority he had so confidently assumed. The second, decisive power reversal had been executed flawlessly, leaving me in a position of undeniable strength while he struggled to save face. The long years of effort, patience, and strategy had culminated in this moment, and the satisfaction of justice, earned and quiet, coursed through me in a way I had never felt before. Weeks after the climactic client meeting, the acknowledgement I had long deserved finally arrived, and it hit harder than I expected. My boss, still struggling to maintain the facade of authority, had no choice but to submit a recommendation for my promotion. The HR manager called me into the office with a warm smile, handing me the official paperwork and offering congratulations that felt almost surreal. For years, I had been dismissed, overlooked, and undervalued, yet here I was, finally standing in the light of recognition I had earned. I couldn't help but reflect on the contrast. Not long ago, I had walked through the same office with a weight on my shoulders, every effort unnoticed, every word dismissed. The same people who barely glanced at my reports now sought my input, praised my judgment, and deferred to my expertise. It was an almost cinematic reversal. The unnoticed, underappreciated employee had become indispensable and celebrated, and the boss who had doubted me could no longer hide the disparity. Colleagues approached with congratulations, some whispering about how long it had taken for my value to be recognized, others simply acknowledging my transformation with quiet admiration. The satisfaction was profound not only for the personal validation, but for the justice of the situation. The years of patience, strategy, and restraint had led to a moment where recognition wasn't just given, it was inevitable, undeniable, and visible to everyone who had ever ignored me. Even my boss, seated across the room during the announcement, wore the mask of professionalism. But I caught the tension beneath it. He was forced to witness the outcome of decisions he had long assumed would go unnoticed. And while he could not undo the past, the contrast between rejected and empowered, invisible and celebrated, was stark. I felt a deep, quiet catharsis, the kind that comes not from revenge alone, but from the triumph of perseverance, strategy, and self-worth. Walking back to my desk with the promotion in hand, I allowed myself a moment to soak in the reality. I had been undervalued for years, yet through patience, calculated effort, and a refusal to be invisible, I had achieved more than recognition. I had claimed the respect, authority, and validation that had been denied to me. The office felt different now. I walked taller, not out of arrogance, but because the balance had shifted, and justice, however subtle, had finally been served. Sitting alone in my office after the whirlwind of recognition, I allowed myself to reflect on everything that had led to this point. Years of patience, of quietly enduring dismissal and favoritism, had taught me more than any seminar or training ever could. Strategic restraint had been my secret weapon, choosing when to act, when to remain silent, and when to let the consequences of my boss's arrogance unfold naturally. Each calculated step had built toward this moment. And now the payoff wasn't just external acknowledgement, it was the personal growth I had cultivated along the way. I thought about him, the boss who had underestimated me for years, whose confidence had been so fragile that he couldn't see the quiet competence beside him. His arrogance had blinded him, making him think that status and favoritism could outweigh skill and dedication. Watching him flounder, forced to recognize my contributions publicly, had been satisfying in a subtle, almost cinematic way. But the real victory lay in knowing that I had orchestrated it without compromising my integrity. Colleagues approached with congratulations, some whispering about how long it had taken for my value to be recognized, others simply acknowledging my transformation with quiet admiration. The satisfaction was profound, not only for the personal validation, but for the justice of the situation. The years of patience, strategy, and restraint had led to a moment where recognition wasn't just given, it was inevitable, undeniable, and visible to everyone who had ever ignored me. Even my boss, seated across the room during the announcement, wore the mask of professionalism. But I caught the tension beneath it. He was forced to witness the outcome of decisions he had long assumed would go unnoticed. And while he could not undo the past, the contrast between rejected and empowered, invisible and celebrated, was stark. I felt a deep, quiet catharsis, the kind that comes not from revenge alone, but from the triumph of perseverance, strategy, and self-worth. Walking back to my desk with the promotion in hand, I allowed myself a moment to soak in the reality. I had been undervalued for years, yet through patience, calculated effort, and a refusal to be invisible, I had achieved more than recognition. I had claimed the respect, authority, and validation that had been denied to me. The office felt different now. I walked taller, not out of arrogance, but because the balance had shifted, and justice, however subtle, had finally been served. Sitting alone in my office after the whirlwind of recognition, I allowed myself to reflect on everything that had led to this point. Years of patience, of quietly enduring dismissal and favoritism, had taught me more than any seminar or training ever could. Strategic restraint had been my secret weapon, choosing when to act, when to remain silent, and when to let the consequences of my boss's arrogance unfold naturally. Each calculated step had built toward this moment. And now the payoff wasn't just external acknowledgement, it was the personal growth I had cultivated along the way. I thought about him, the boss who had underestimated me for years, whose confidence had been so fragile that he couldn't see the quiet competence beside him. His arrogance had blinded him, making him think that status and favoritism could outweigh skill and dedication. Watching him flounder, forced to recognize my contributions publicly, had been satisfying in a subtle, almost cinematic way. But the real victory lay in knowing that I had orchestrated it without compromising my integrity. There was a bittersweet quality to the triumph. It wasn't about humiliation for its own sake. It was about reclaiming the respect and self-worth that had been denied for too long. The contrast between my calm empowerment and his flustered authority was stark, but it also reminded me of the value of patience and measured action. I had learned that justice doesn't always need to be loud or dramatic. Sometimes the quiet, inevitable unfolding of truth is far more satisfying. As I leaned back in my chair, I felt a sense of closure settle in. I had not only gained recognition and promotion, but had also proven to myself that I could navigate adversity with intelligence, strategy, and emotional control. The internal victory, that knowledge that I had risen on my own terms, with dignity intact, was more powerful than any external reward. And though the memory of years of dismissal still stung, it now served as a reminder of resilience, strength, and the quiet power of perseverance. Months passed, and the office had changed in ways that were both subtle and undeniable. I had settled into my new role, confident and respected, executing projects with the same meticulous care I always had, but now with visibility, authority, and influence that had once seemed impossible. My reputation had grown, and colleagues now sought my advice, consulted me on decisions, and deferred to my judgment without hesitation. The quiet power I had cultivated over months had become fully recognized, and it felt almost effortless, a natural extension of the patience and strategy I had relied on. Meanwhile, my boss struggled to regain footing. Once brimming with confidence and control, he now hesitated in meetings, his words occasionally misaligned with facts, his authority subtly questioned by peers who had long admired his status. It wasn't dramatic humiliation. It was a quiet shift in perception, a slow erosion of the unquestioned power he had assumed. People began consulting me first, double-checking his decisions, and occasionally bypassing him for input, acknowledging, without saying it, that the landscape of influence had irrevocably changed. One morning, I overheard him struggling to justify a minor error during a departmental call, fumbling statistics that I had quietly prepared in the background to support my team. I smiled to myself, a subtle mic-drop moment, knowing that while he had once dismissed me, the consequences of underestimating my value were now unfolding naturally. No confrontation was necessary. His overconfidence and my restraint had done the work for me. It was an elegant, understated reversal, one that left me quietly triumphant. The empowerment wasn't just about recognition or status. It was about proving to myself that perseverance, patience, and strategic action could create results far more satisfying than immediate confrontation or impulsive retaliation. I had turned years of dismissal into fuel, transforming frustration into a path for growth, influence, and personal satisfaction. Looking around at the office, now a space where my presence mattered and my voice carried weight, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment. The balance had shifted, justice had quietly unfolded, and I had emerged not just victorious, but empowered in a way that no external recognition could fully capture. Looking back on everything, the lesson became clear. Patience and calculated restraint are more powerful than impulsive reactions. By observing, strategizing, and choosing the right moments to act, I transformed frustration into tangible success. Standing up for oneself doesn't always mean confrontation. It can mean quietly demonstrating value, setting boundaries, and letting actions speak louder than words. The subtle karmic payoff is undeniable. Those who once dismissed or underestimated me were forced to witness my rise, not through spectacle or anger, but through competence, perseverance, and integrity. It was a quiet justice that resonated far deeper than any immediate revenge could have. Most importantly, I realized self-worth cannot depend on external validation alone. Recognition is sweeter when it comes after consistent effort, strategic choices, and unwavering belief in one's own value. And though the road was long and frustrating, the outcome, personal growth, empowerment, and undeniable acknowledgement, made every moment worth it.